The president announced a new 50% tariff on.
Over time, we become too dependent on the United States as our biggest customer, with more than 90% of our steel exports going south of the border.
They use tariffs to take our businesses, not only steel, other businesses too.
We must rely more on Canadian steel for Canadian projects.
Steel prices in the U.S. have skyrocketed from just over $700 a ton last week to a staggering $900 today. But this dramatic surge didn't come from market speculation or Wall Street trading. It was triggered by a single decision on June 4th, when former President Trump signed an executive order doubling tariffs on imported steel and aluminum to 50%. The impact was immediate. Canada's steel industry, America's most reliable source of metal, halted nearly all outbound shipments. Freight rail cars were left sitting idle. And just across the border, Detroit's automotive plants were hit hard. Production lines slowed, night shifts were suspended, and some paychecks were frozen. While U.S. factories stumbled, Canada's furnaces in Hamilton fired up with renewed intensity, glowing like wartime engines in a scramble to meet new demand elsewhere. Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, wasted no time responding. He condemned the tariff hike as a self-inflicted wound of historic proportions and warned Washington that retaliatory export controls on key minerals could be next. So, how did a policy aimed at revitalizing American industry end up threatening its most critical manufacturing hub, Motor City? Who's going to bear the cost of these stalled production lines? Ottawa, Beijing, or everyday Americans on Main Street? Stay with us. The chain reaction began early on June 4th when the White House announced the new tariffs in the Federal Register, hours before most Washington commuters even hit the highway. By midday, steel imports were subject to a steep new 50% duty, double the 2018 rate, effectively pricing out many of the world's largest producers. Within hours, calls and emails spread across North America. Any steel that cleared customs under the old rates would become unprofitable by the very next day. Markets move fast. On June 5th, steel futures jumped again. Major mills raised their base price to $900 per short ton, an increase of nearly $150 in just 2 weeks. For automakers like Ford, that's a slow-motion shockwave. One pickup truck uses about a ton of steel. Multiply that by 1.5 million trucks, and Ford alone is staring down $500 million in added costs before assembly even begins. But the most serious blow may have come from Canada. Catherine Cobden, head of the Canadian Steel Producers Association, reported that U.S. orders had basically disappeared. Translation: Canada's usual 12 million tons of annual steel exports to the U.S. are now stuck, and with them, the raw material that fuels Detroit's stamping presses. While U.S. plants struggle to find supplies, Canadian mills are shifting focus, ramping up production to serve Asian buyers instead. Ford's historic River Rouge complex has already idled 2 lines due to lack of materials, and investors took notice. By day's end, Wall Street reacted sharply. The S&P 500 dropped nearly 0.75%, with concerns mounting about the long-term ripple effects of this escalating trade disruption. Markets called it a Trump session teaser, a sudden dip that signaled more turbulence ahead. The irony? A tariff wall designed to protect American jobs has, in just its first week, outsourced critical raw materials, stalled assembly lines in Motor City, and handed supply chain control to Canada. And this is just the beginning. Ford saw it coming. Back on May 7, 2025, CEO Jim Farley publicly warned that the 50% tariff on steel and aluminum would hit the company with a $2.5 billion charge, forcing Ford to withdraw its profit forecast immediately. But the alarm bells had already started ringing a month earlier. On March 4th, a Reuters report estimated that the tariffs could raise prices on some Mexico-built vehicles by as much as 25%, translating to around $2,000 more for a mid-size crossover. The result? Sticker shock across the country. By the following weekend, dealerships from San Antonio to Seattle began tacking on temporary surcharges for import-heavy trims. Factory order rates slowed, and customers hesitated. But the most painful impact didn't show up in car prices. It showed up in job numbers. By April 4th, Michigan's unemployment rate had spiked to 5.4%, the highest in the country, and more than a full point above the national average. Economists pointed to a single missing link: Canadian steel. Every F-150 built in Dearborn requires 1 ton of it. At $900 per ton, Ford's River Rouge plant is spending over $100,000 on steel every 3 minutes. With 1.5 million trucks planned, that adds up to more than $1.3 billion before a single worker is paid or a coat of paint is applied. The crisis drew attention on Capitol Hill. On July 21st, a bipartisan group of senators from the Great Lakes region traveled to Ottawa, urging Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to ease what they called a metal blockade. But Carney offered no promises, only talk of potential export quotas that could keep even more Canadian steel at home. The reality is stark. A trade barrier meant to protect American manufacturing is now starving Detroit of the materials it needs to function. Canada holds the steering wheel of the continent's supply chain, while Main Street USA watches the layoff numbers climb. And unless this wall comes down quickly, the country could be heading toward a 2008-style auto industry crisis, with no bailout waiting this time. Canada isn't wasting time. Prime Minister Carney treated Trump's June tariff order like a green light. Just after sunrise on July 16th, he announced a $1 billion Canadian steel modernization fund aimed at upgrading Ontario's mills by replacing coal-fired furnaces with electric arc and hydrogen technology. Less than an hour later, Ottawa tightened import rules. Any steel from outside of Canada's free trade agreements now faces a strict quota, and once that cap is hit, a 50% duty snaps into place. That effectively blocks cheap steel from countries like Turkey and Brazil, unless buyers are willing to absorb a higher cost than the U.S. tariff itself. But for Canada, the math works. Ontario's grid is already 93% clean, powered by hydroelectric dams along the Niagara and robust nuclear backbone. In short, Canada just turned climate leverage into trade power and left America scrambling for steel. Canada is quietly rewriting the rules of the steel game, and it's doing it with clean energy. According to Ontario's Independent Electricity System Operator, IESO, the province's low-emission power grid makes Hamilton steel furnaces 3 to 4 times cleaner than the global average. And that green advantage is about to become pure gold. In 2026, the European Union will begin enforcing its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBM, which will place tariffs on imported goods based on how much carbon is embedded in their production. For Hamilton's largest steelmaker, ArcelorMittal Dofasco, that's a game changer. Backed by Canada's new Steel Modernization Fund, they've already broken ground on a next-generation direct reduced iron, DRI unit. This DRI facility will feed 2 electric arc furnaces, replacing older, dirtier methods and cutting an estimated 5 million tons of emissions each year. And it doesn't end there. Once natural gas prices stabilize, this clean steel setup is expected to lower production costs significantly, giving Canadian producers a powerful edge in the global market. Meanwhile, in the U.S., Detroit watches from the sidelines. Every ton of Canadian steel that once headed south by rail is now rerouted to ports like Rotterdam and Busan, marked as CBM compliant and commanding premium prices that U.S. automakers simply can't match. By the time Ford's River Rouge plant is back at full throttle, Ottawa's green bet may have already locked Canada into Europe's high-value supply chain, leaving Motor City stuck with the economic fallout of U.S. tariff policy. And that raises the billion-dollar question. How do you compete with a neighbor who just turned your tariff shock into a clean steel breakthrough? Canada's western provinces aren't retaliating, they're redirecting. On July 22nd, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario sign a new agreement requiring that all future oil and mineral infrastructure, including pipelines, rail links, and access roads, use steel that's melted and poured in Ontario. That effectively bars U.S. pipe mills from bidding on those massive contracts. It's a sharp blow. According to the American Iron and Steel Institute, Canada exported roughly 6.56 million tons of steel to the U.S. last year. Of that, over 1 million tons were line pipe, now locked down for Canadian use or redirected to global partners, bypassing U.S. customs entirely. Ottawa isn't stopping there. A new trade bulletin issued last week slashed the import quota for tube and pipe from non-free trade countries to half of last year's level. Once that cap is reached, a steep 50% tariff kicks in. The result? Immediate pressure on U.S. energy contractors. Before this trade conflict, America imported around 40% of its oil country tubular goods, OCTG, the essential pipes that keep oil wells functioning. As of March 12th, analysts reported that while Canada and Mexico still accounted for 16% of those imports, the landed cost was projected to rise by at least 15% this year. For smaller drilling companies in Texas and North Dakota, the added costs are already biting. They can't secure pipe deliveries without absorbing the new premium. Meanwhile, midstream service firms, those handling transportation and storage, are watching multi-million-dollar contracts evaporate as Alberta demands that all structural steel be sourced domestically. The bottom line: Canada is using clean energy policy and strategic trade moves to quietly corner North America's steel advantage, while U.S. industry absorbs the tariff bill, one delayed shipment at a time. Maintenance crews on the U.S. Midwest pipeline grid are now cannibalizing their own stockpiles, breaking down existing parts just to keep critical infrastructure running. Why? Because new steel components are stuck in customs limbo, caught between tariff rules and international quota caps. Corporate America has no quick fix. Building new electric resistance weld ERW mills takes years. Shipping crude by rail brings higher insurance costs and greater risk of derailments. Meanwhile, Alberta is capitalizing, both financially and politically. With one trade memo and a small quota revision, Canada has turned its clean energy advantage into a strategic weapon. Fabrication jobs are staying north of the border, framed as a national energy security play. And while American suppliers face empty order books and idle machines, Europe is quietly implementing its own industrial reshuffle. On January 1st, 2026, the European Union officially launched its Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Every imported ton of steel is now subject to the same carbon costs that EU mills pay, an estimated $88.95 per ton. That means any steel entering ports like Antwerp now carries an automatic surcharge, unless it comes from a clean producer. And here's the pivot: Canada's steel, powered by hydro and nuclear, qualifies. On February 18, 2025, consultants at Anthesys told clients that Canadian coil was already CBM ready, low carbon, premium eligible, and poised to outcompete higher emission producers. That includes the U.S., where 63% of steel is still made using coal-fired blast furnaces. So every truckload of steel once bound for Michigan can now reroute to Rotterdam, commanding a higher price, avoiding U.S. tariffs, and clearing Europe's carbon gate with ease. For American families, the costs stack up quickly. According to the Tax Foundation, President Trump's tariff policies are expected to cost the average U.S. household $1,296 this year, the equivalent of an entire month's worth of groceries. Executives in Detroit know the trap they're in. Either pay Europe's carbon surcharge and lose pricing power abroad, or absorb a 50% tariff at home and struggle to stay competitive. Both paths shred already fragile margins, still recovering from the post-pandemic supply chain crunch. Europe, meanwhile, offers a third way: a carbon passport. Any producer operating below the EU's average carbon intensity pays zero at the border. Canadian mills qualify. U.S. mills, still coal-heavy, do not. Trump built a tariff wall to protect American jobs. Brussels built a carbon toll gate, and Canada just opened its side door. The global supply chain is simply following the path of least resistance. So the question now is simple: should Washington rush toward clean steel, or keep the tariff shield up and hope the world waits? Let us know in the comments below. Michigan just lost one of its proudest titles, its Star Employment Badge, and Congress can't agree on who's to blame. While lawmakers in Washington debate, Canada is already acting. Backed by clean power and hydrogen, Canadian steel mills are being rebuilt from the ground up. And in less than a year, Europe will flip the switch on CBM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Starting January 2026, steel producers will be charged based on how much carbon is embedded in their products. Canadian coil will enter Europe tariff-free, riding a carbon passport. Meanwhile, U.S. steel, made in coal-fired furnaces, could face a double penalty: a tariff at home and a carbon tax abroad. There's still time to negotiate. The policy window isn't fully closed, but the countdown has begun. So here's the real question: will Washington defuse the tariff time bomb before it detonates? Or double down and risk being left behind as global buyers shift toward cleaner, greener steel? Drop your take in the comments, because your voice may help shape what comes next in this high-stakes battle over steel, climate, and the future of American industry.